Hello, people. It's the early hours of the morning, about 4 a.m. Actually, 20 to 5. And yeah, this is an example of my irregular sleeping pattern. But I thought I'd do something productive and upload this video. This is actually the old laptop, as I explained before. I may start re-uploading videos on this laptop. Um, the good side is the sound seems to be good. I've looked at it, it seems to be better sound. But the downside is the upload time is pretty long. My last video took about 3 hours to upload, which is crazy. I don't mind. It's not such a big problem because I can just get on with other things. But it is longer. Anyway, regardless, I think it's important to make these videos. So this one is sort of coming from an idea that one of my subscribers gave, and I don't think he will mind me mentioning him here. Alex Young in Italy. He's based in Italy at the moment. He made a comment on my last video about online dating in 2023, and I'm going to quote that comment directly in a minute. But just a quick thing, I don't usually do sort of requests or video ideas as such, simply because whilst I really respect that a lot of my subscribers have great ideas, and I really value their interest and input, I think in order to be authentic, I really have to be in the mind of a particular subject when I'm making it, rather than just doing like, oh, what shall I talk about today? Because I usually know what I'm going to talk about. So I think in order to be authentic, rather than just let it become a sort of mundane thing, that's why I don't do requests. But certainly I value all feedback, and I really appreciate the time that people spend watching my videos. Feel free to like and share. So the subject of this video definitely overlaps with the last one, but it goes into other areas as well, maybe beyond that. And it's about loneliness, and particularly loneliness for men, and masculinity. This is what Alex was striving at, and both subjects perhaps come into that. I should say a quick disclaimer at this point for any women watching. Please don't misunderstand me. In no way am I suggesting that this is something only men face. Um, one good thing about the 21st century is that there has definitely, in my opinion, been improved attitudes towards mental health, or at least improved recognitions of mental health issues. Now, I'm not saying that it's totally understood. Mental health is a complex subject, any sort of mental health. Not to derail, but I watched a very good film yesterday with Olivia Colman, Empire of Light. I really recommend it. But this isn't a film review, so I'll just mention it very briefly. And without giving any spoilers, the film touches quite heavily on the subject of mental health. And it shows how, for other people, it can actually be scary. For the person going through a mental health crisis, it could be scary. But actually, for other people unsure how to deal with it, it can also be quite an uneasy feeling. And you'll see what I'm talking about if you see the film. It's yeah, I do recommend it. Empire of Light, set in Margate in the early 1980s, around the cinema, and human connections, and unexpected human connections. Anyway, good movie, check it out. But loneliness is, I think, it's one of these things that's always been with us. It's always been, so long as human beings have had a conscience, loneliness has been there. It may be true to say that paradoxically, although our understanding and empathy around mental health issues has improved, loneliness may have increased. It's one of those things I think that's very, very difficult to gauge, and it's very hard to work out by statistics. You know, some statistics are relatively easy to work out. Homicide rates, for example, there's a homicide's a very direct, obvious thing in most cases. So you could say, well, Britain's had so many homicides per year, right? Road accidents, again, this is something that there's evidence for it. You can work out the statistics. With loneliness, it's harder, because all you can really do is do a vox pop. Have you felt lonely this week? Or get some sort of generic idea. Probably it impacts some people more than others. Older people, certainly. if their partners have passed away, perhaps they're not in touch with their children. Certainly, a lot of charities for older people, this is one of their big concerns: loneliness. Homeless people, that goes without saying, they're already on the margins of society. That can be very tough. And in my experience, sometimes rough sleepers, especially, it's not even that they're necessarily looking for money. Sometimes they simply want to be acknowledged as a human being. I know situations where I've walked past and I've said honestly that I don't have any change. Although in recent years I've tried to buy them a hot drink rather than just give change to them. But the very fact that I've acknowledged them, they've actually said, "No worries, Governor," or something like that. They appreciate the very fact that I'm simply acknowledging them as a human being rather than simply walking past. So certainly homeless people, men, which is, well, men is half the population, so that's a little bit too generic. Um, what else? People in certain professions, maybe working night shifts, maybe, I don't know, maybe professions that are freelance, which is something I can relate to, where you don't really have colleagues. Prisoners, so there's a lot of areas that loneliness is definitely going to be a higher component, or a higher likelihood, perhaps. But it can happen to anyone. It can happen to anyone. And one thing about mental health, I think it's important to point out, is that you may be unhappy about a particular thing that's missing in your life, um, and assume that people who have that thing are therefore happy. But it works differently for different people. Example: we all know that, no matter what people say, money provides stability. It does, and that can provide some of the platform for happiness. So much involves money, but you could have someone who's very, very well off, very comfortable, even rich. They might be in a loveless marriage. That's another thing. We assume that couples are always happy or not lonely. Actually, from what I gather, thankfully I've never been in this situation, but being in a loveless marriage or a loveless serious relationship where there's a mundane thing, I think can be very lonely. Marriage, particularly, because it's hard to get out of. Divorce is not something done lightly, so um, that's something I think is very, very difficult if you're in a situation where maybe the outside world assumes you're happy and you're really not. So. Um, Now, without further ado, I'm going to just read out what Alex wrote because I think it's very good. It's worth thinking about, and I don't think he will mind me doing this. So this is compliments of Alex Young. Hi, it's really nice to see your videos. There are many things that I want to talk about when it comes to dating and friendships, which is I watch a number of your videos about your experiences of loneliness and dating as a man. This is where I want to ask about when it comes to masculinity. Because one of the things that bothers me about it is that there seems to be a rise of loneliness, especially men receiving all these mixed messages. What it means to be a man that includes toxic masculinity, positive masculinity, macho culture, etc. This basically is a prison trap because on one hand you have a crowd of people saying you're bad, you should be ashamed of yourself. The other crowd calling you weak. Some of them look through the lens of social Darwinism with a nihilist worldview, saying it's a harsh truth. Um, and you name it from what I've seen. And you name it from what I've seen, people seem to be intellectually dishonest when it comes to masculinity. With all this wishy-washy rhetoric they're espousing, it isn't really any good. In fact, it's making it really difficult for men to come forward. So if you're a reasonable person, while you're disagreeing with a crowd of people, as I mentioned above, they pretty much all look down on you. So to keep in mind what we really want as people, especially men who are going through this, need to be viewed as people who needs empathy, with worthy of consideration, worthy of love, and worthy of respect. So anyway, tell me about your thoughts. I would love to hear your perspectives on this. So Alex, I'm kind of doing this through the video rather than replying at length to the comment, which is another thing I tend not to do. And let's see, I think you'd actually another comment on this thread, if you just bear with me. No, I haven't yet considered dating right now. This was in reference to my online dating video, because I mainly want to focus on making more friends and talk to more people in the long run, although I may consider to do something like that in the future, which probably wouldn't involve online dating. The reason why I ask these questions is that I want to hear what he has to say about the loneliness epidemic. He talks about it on his other videos, and yes, I just want to hear his thoughts on it. Um, okay, there's a number of things to digest there, and apologies if I don't address every single point. I'll try and get the main points there regarding masculinity, image of men, loneliness. A little disclaimer here, and I don't think there's anything wrong with saying this. I joined a kind of social group last week called Andy's Men's Club. They're based all over the country, so if you check out Facebook, you know, your local group may well be there. If you're not on Facebook, check out the website, Andy's Men's Club. It's named from what I gather, from a man who took his own life. So his brother set up this group basically for men to talk. It's similar to the work that mine does, although mine's a bit wider. Um, I've only been once, but I found it helpful. Just basically men getting together in a social format and talking about their problems. Now, it might not be for everyone, but you know that it's non-judgment. You know that you go there, people are compassionate, open-minded. There's a little bit of banter in the sense of, it's not so serious. And these are not trained counselors or therapists. It's really just peers. But I find it helpful. I'll go, it's every Monday, so I'll probably go back. So if you're interested, do check that out. I don't think there's anything wrong with me mentioning it. Andy's Men's Club, they're based all over the country. I think there's 117 venues, so there should be one in every big town or city, I think. Maybe even in some smaller places. I don't know, to be honest, but here in Sunderland, it's a good group. I think there was about 40 people the last time I was there. Um, and again, this taps back into, yeah, there's a lot of pressure on men nowadays, but I also feel that there's more understanding. So that's a good thing. I genuinely think, like, take for example, in the past, up till about the 70s or 80s, where you had particularly um, northern industrial places with heavy industry, shipbuilding, coal mining, steelworks, and so on. There was a very macho culture where men wouldn't have spoken about the problems because they would have seen that sort of being in touch with feelings to be effeminate or weak, even, which of course is nonsense. It's not. But that was the culture. So probably in the past, people drank away their issues, which wasn't healthy. Yet we know that men still take their own lives 3 times as much as women. So there's a problem. Apparently, actually, women make more suicide attempts, but men are more likely to go through with it. So there must be some phenomenon in that. But we hear a lot about male suicide. Women get lonely too. We shouldn't disregard that. I read a sad case this week about a young woman who had um, taken her own life. She was only in her 20s, and she had actually, I think it was on LBC News, she'd actually helped other people. And when her parents were visiting her graveside, they saw messages from strangers basically acknowledging that her dialogue with them, her communication had helped them, her plain talking. So it's sad that she couldn't find that confidence or reassurance herself. Um, this is why mental health issues is so important. Um, but in terms of this loneliness epidemic, again, like I said, it's hard to ascertain the figures on this, but I do think it is quite widespread. Certainly, the pandemic, like so many things, it affected so much. We in Britain, we're more or less out of that now. I think it's fair to say that we're not. This is not, the situation in January 2023 is not what it was in the summer of 2020. So we're definitely out of that, but probably some of the implications of that, maybe relationships broke down, maybe people lost loved ones. There's a lot of factors that maybe are hidden that are still around. Um, so I guess the question is, what correlates male loneliness with some of the things you mentioned there, Alex? I think masculinity is very hard to define, actually. It's not something that can be easily described. I think it's almost like faith in the sense it's quite a personal thing, because what is masculinity for one man is perhaps not masculinity for another. Now, we've all heard toxic masculinity. Um, Feminists particularly talk a lot about that. Um, but it's again something that's not that easily described. I actually do think within male groups, within male communities, which is probably can't word it like that because we're not a segregated society, but among men, I do think there's such a thing as a sort of toxic behaviour. I don't know whether we should call it toxic masculinity, but it is this sort of lad culture whereby you get groups of men, particularly young men, and it's this boisterous sort of, oh, well, let's just be loud and obnoxious and take over the place. I've seen it many times directly, so this is not hyperbole. It's not something that's invented by feminists. I think there is a problem with that. And, it's this group mindset, this gang mindset, to use its more extreme example, whereby if you act in a certain way, your peers are going to accept you. And it's perhaps in other countries it would be called machismo. I don't know, but it can be toxic because that is precisely the sort of behaviour that can result in actually serious crime, and sometimes even you get it's depressing to talk about, but you even got a mob of guys killing another young man because he looked at them the wrong way. That sort of behaviour, or football hooliganism, I would say, is a good example. A very apt example of what toxic masculinity is. It's this moronic, brainless mindset of, oh, I've had a few beers, my team's won, so it's this tribal mindset, and it's utterly pathetic. I've no respect for it, and I'm not interested in making excuses for men like that either. I think it's if you're a grown man and you cannot control your emotions at a sporting event, you need help, really. Um, but more to the point, I it's something that gives me anxiety if I'm on public transport and some drunk football fans get on. It's not necessarily that they're going to be violent. Most of the time they won't, but it can be quite intimidating because now I'm thinking if it intimidates me as a healthy young guy, what would that be like for an older person or young family? You know, so it kind of disgusts me, to be quite blunt about it. It's so that to me is toxic masculinity, and I do think the onus is on us men to call it out. You know, because that's not being a man; that's being an idiot. It really is. And you get this to some extent in the emergency services and in the armed forces, where sometimes there's a fine line between banter and bullying, right? I think banter is, within reason, it can be an okay thing. It can lessen the tension. It could be as long as it's mutual. I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing. The same with the more moderate aspects of lad culture, just guys having a laugh, having drinks together, that sort of thing. I have no problem with, but it's I think the problem with any group dynamic, and you get the same, to be honest, with hen parties. A group of drunk women can be a nightmare. I think. So people lose their inhibitions when they're in a group, and it's a bit pathetic. Actually, it's something I've never had much respect for. That people become so void of responsibility when they're in a group dynamic. It's something I find hard to respect. Because the thing is, as individuals, they probably wouldn't behave that way. So it's a bit cardly in that sense. Um, anyway, I derail here, but I'm trying to sort of reflect on what I think about masculinity. But that's toxic masculinity. But here's where I draw a big line. Particularly among woke ideology, particularly among feminists, there's this idea that therefore all masculinity must be bad. Now, to me, actually, the idea of being an alpha male, let's say a man who is protective of the people that he loves, a man who is um, assertive, a man who's confident, perhaps. And this is not to, say this is how people should be, but I'm just trying to elaborate on what perhaps we mean by this positive masculinity. A man who, um, yeah, who knows what he believes in and who's not afraid to stand up for his conviction. Those can all be positive things. Um, I think that's good, and I think that's something to be celebrated. International Men's Day, which is in November, I think it's 21st. That's a good event to mark International Men's Day. It's not officially recognised by the UN the way International Women's Day is. However, it does have quite widespread recognition in India, in the US, and the UK. That's a very good thing, and I strongly support it. I tried to do something that day just to sort of send out the message. Um, so with that, I mean, this is what I would say about positive masculinity. And by the way, Will Noland, the lecturer who was involved in the Eton controversy, well, I don't think it should have been a controversy, but I think it was last year. He basically uploaded a lesson. He had a online lesson for his students at Eton College about the whole idea of patriarchy and masculinity and so on. I watched it. It was a little rushed. It could have been better. It was a little bit rushed. It was a little bit, and there were some statements he made that perhaps warrant a little bit more evidence. However, I thought overall he tapped into some very important issues, and I thought it was a good lecture. But immediately he was denounced as a misogynist because he was teaching young men a certain thing. Now, if you know someone like, what's his name, Andrew Tate, the contrast between what Will Noland was doing and the sort of nonsense that Andrew Tate comes out with could not be greater. Yet some feminists will just lump them into one bracket, and that's wrong. I think it's wrong. I think if it's perfectly okay for female lecturers to talk to young women about issues impacting women, it shouldn't be a problem for a male lecturer to talk to young men about issues impacting men. In fact, it's very important when we have so many men taking their own lives. So I strongly support Will Noland in that. I think it was a disgrace that Eton pushed him out. Um, so I really think that, yeah, that was a good example of how sometimes when men do talk about these things, they're silenced. But anyway, hopefully it's still on YouTube. Hopefully people can find it. If I do, I'll try and put a link here. Um, But I would draw an example at this point when we're talking about good masculinity. If you have throughout history, and I think Will Noland touched on this, wherever you've had some sort of threat, right? Let's say in classical warfare throughout history, what happens when you have an invading army or invading force coming to sack the city? What happens? The women and children are put into some sort of hiding or they're protected, and the men defend the city, right? And on a more broad sense, countries. This has happened throughout history. So, feminists might justifiably say most wars started by men. Almost every war started by men. There have been some wars at the hands of women, warlike queens um, and other, heads of state. But let's be honest, the vast majority of conflict has been at the hands of men. Um, right, so feminists might say, well, men can't talk about men dying in war because it's men who start the wars. Yeah, but it's what they're ignoring is there's also a unique onus on men to be the defenders. Okay, so what happened when Russia invaded Ukraine? All Ukrainian fighting age men were basically legally obliged to stay and fight. Zelensky, rightly or wrongly, brought in a mandate that every fighting age man in Ukraine had to stay um, by law, by law, and they've died in their thousands. Young Russian men have died in their thousands because of the lies of a dictator. So this flies in the face of so-called male privilege. To me, male privilege is like white privilege. It's an obnoxious, dishonest notion. It really needs to be dismantled. Feminists might say, and I don't want to get into the whole male versus female thing here, but they might say, oh, well, men are paid more. Well, again, this is a little bit of this is somewhat misleading because the vast majority of jobs, men and women, are paid the same. What they're talking about is perhaps higher end jobs, and maybe there's something there. I'm not qualified to talk in great detail about that, um, but I think it's misleading to say. I saw a book recently, Waterstones, Why Women Are Poorer Than Men, and that's clearly somewhat scaremongering because it implies that the average woman is paid less than the average man. I think that's misleading. Um, every job I've ever had, it's been a standard rate for everyone. Anyway, I digress a bit here. I know the issues about loneliness, but to be honest, all of this probably ties together anyway, because this idea of I mean, I have to say, we shouldn't get too carried away. I don't think it's the case that society is saying you have to be this or you have to be that necessarily. I honestly don't think society is as rigid as it perhaps once was, and that's a good thing. Um, really, I do think. I mean, we've come a long way on LGBT issues. This week, Chris Eubank Jr., the boxer, sent out a strong message by wearing an LGBT band because his opponent Liam Smith had made remarks sort of, well, I've never seen you with a girl, and it was a bit of a. To be honest, that was probably just boxing hype. But both men apologised for their taunts at each other. That's the way boxing goes. But it's just an example. It's just an example because people were, backing Eubank. Now there would have been a time when a gay boxer, not that he is gay, he's straight, but he was just sending out a message. That would have been taboo. Same in football. I do think things have changed in that regard for the better. Although I don't like some of the intolerance coming from the LGBT lobby itself, particularly around trans issues. But Britain is definitely a more tolerant country than it used to be. That's a good thing. Um, but loneliness, it's like just to get back to some of your points, Alex, because it's an important thing, and I'm just trying to, I don't want to address point by point, but um, you've mentioned you want to focus on making more friends. Well, this is a thing apparently. Actually, that's another thing that's perhaps been lost in recent years. A lot of men lack friends. Forget even romantic relationships with women. Um, simple friendship. I mean, I have to be honest. I don't really have a group of drinking buddies as such. My good friends are gay men, and I totally value them. They're good people. I value their friendship, and I will always defend them. But they they wouldn't necessarily see the world the way I would as a straight man. So I don't have really a group of straight guys that I get out with and drink. I've never had that. I've never really had like a bro circuit. And sometimes I regret that. Sometimes I think that might have been a good thing. But loneliness is definitely something that I think anyone who says they've never been lonely is lying. But I do think some people get lonely more than others. Now, I won't repeat everything I've said about online dating, but that just reiterates the challenges that we face. This video is getting quite long, so I'm going to wrap up soon. But I think with all of this, with this perception of what masculinity should be, actually, and I didn't finish talking about positive masculinity. Maybe I derailed myself a little bit there. Okay, let me put it this way. Um, Here's an example I would use, and I hope this is an apt example. I believe it is, but there's a famous incident on Flight 93, United 93, on September 11th, 2001. This was the fourth hijacked plane. Now, what happened, if anyone who knows this, if you've seen the films, you'll know the story, but basically, the hijackers, for some reason, they hesitated. Maybe they were missing a hijacker, or whatever it was, they hesitated. But this gave the passengers enough time to work out what was going on. It was a passenger plane. I think it was 40 passengers. They started working out what was going on. They could see the news from the relatives were deciphering this through the plane's phone system, and they started working out what was happening. So at some point, a group of these passengers, led by a group of young men, um, Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, um, and Jeremy Glick, and there were a few other guys, and they basically said, we're going to have to do something ourselves here. We need to get the strongest guys in the group. I mean, this isn't verbatim. We don't know exactly what transpired, but we've a strong idea that basically a group of these guys got together and said, they formed a plan basically to try and retake control of the plane from the hijackers, from the terrorists, and maybe if someone had flight experience, maybe they could be guided down. Now, sadly, of course, the plane came down and everyone on board died. But this, to me, really, flies in the face of toxic masculinity. Here you have a group of guys. Actually, they weren't all straight. One of them, I believe, was a gay man. But the point is, they were men. They were doing something incredibly brave. And of course, all the passengers helped out, but they were the people who really initiated this and said, we need to take action here. Now, to me, that's incredibly courageous, and no one should ever be in that position. But what I would say is people who want to discard alpha males should think very carefully about that. What happens when you have, let's say, a room full of heavy boxes and you have a group of people and it's men and women. Who's going to be doing the lifting? It's going to be men, really. You know, uh, if women want to say I'm a strong, independent woman, that's fine. I respect that. But I think there has to be a basic concession that the average man is stronger than the average woman. That's not sexist. It's just biology. So in that situation, if heavy boxes have to be lifted, and there's if you have like a healthy young man and a pregnant woman, obviously it's going to be the healthy young man that lifts it, and that's reasonable. That's what man would expect a pregnant woman to lift boxes while he's standing there. That would be absurd. I've been on a train in the Far East where young women were struggling with luggage, and I I lifted the bags up. But I wasn't. It's not so much a case of chivalry, although perhaps that's it. But if that had been an old man, I would have done the same thing. So it's it's just knowing your abilities as a healthy young man, and using them in a positive way. Um, what else could be said? I really do want to wrap this up soon, because believe me, it takes forever to upload. But I don't have a magic wand in terms of curing loneliness, except to say that we're not really alone, because that other lonely people are out there. Um, Talking definitely is a factor. The way people see the world is different too. There's no set thing, right? So the way you see something isn't going to be exactly the way someone else sees it. But simply talking, sharing ideas. If you can upload videos, I find this helpful. Um, I mentioned Andy's Men's Club. That's been helpful so far. Um, but in terms of, I think keeping busy as well is a very good thing. Keeping your mind creative, keeping busy. Yeah. Okay, guys. I've spoken about this. This is 33 minutes, and I really should wrap this up, because believe me, it takes forever. So yeah. Thanks for watching, and thanks, Alex, for your idea. Um, Apologies, the video was a little bit fragmented. It's not quite as tidy as I would have liked, because I was trying to encompass a lot of different ideas. But that's basically what I think. I think that we can get really hung up on what is masculinity. It's better to be ourselves. It's better to just um, because remember, being a man isn't what defines you. You know, you're an individual. So being a man doesn't define you any more than being black or white or gay or straight or anything else. It's part of it. But I mean, I'm not ashamed of being a man, but it's not something that I sort of, and I mark like, International Men's Day and so on. And I try to be a good man. I try to be a responsible man. And I try to be the sort of man, for example, who would stick up for someone more vulnerable than myself. If I saw a woman being attacked, my natural instinct would be to get in there and do something. And I have, as a matter of fact. I'm not, trying to imply something that I'm not, but um, I've been in situations. Uh, I've stood up to bullies. I've done things. And as long as you know in yourself that you are doing the right thing, you shouldn't get too hung up on, well, this is what is a man or what isn't. But I will say this as a closing caveat: anyone who thinks that alpha males should be discarded, or actually, I'll yeah scratch that out. Not alpha males, but let's say I'll rephrase that: traditional males, because alpha, beta, all of that has now become all politicized in of itself. But let's just say this idea that all men should be, because you see, I think being in touch with our feelings and being honest about them and being compassionate are all very good things. But at the same time, being strong, being brave, they are also good things, because it's not just about ourselves. It's not just about image. If you have a dangerous situation, particularly involving violence or something like that, I mean, I personally, I definitely would be the sort of man that would be protective of my. I would not want to be in a relationship, for example, where the woman is always, I can take care of myself. That's naive, and it's actually rather emasculating, I think. I'm not talking about smothering her, but I'm attracted to feminine women for that reason, because I just think that opposites attract. And I'm not judging anyone, I'm not condemning anyone. I just personally think that opposites attract. Anyway, thanks for watching. Whoa, 36 minutes. I really should round this up. But anyway, it's not just loneliness, it's masculinity, it's lots of things. If you watched this the whole way through, Alex, I hope you have. Thank you. Let me know your thoughts.